My name is Arthur. I am 100 years old, and before you decide that I have all the answers, let me tell you something more honest. I spent most of my life believing I understood what it meant to grow old, and I was wrong. For years, I followed the advice everyone repeated with confidence: eat well, stay active, keep your mind busy, find a purpose, build good habits. Those things can certainly support a healthier life, and many of them are worth doing. But I quietly expected them to protect me from the deeper struggles that often come with aging. They did not. That was the mistake that changed everything. The greatest surprise was never the wrinkles on my face or the gray in my hair. It was discovering that growing older asks questions no simple checklist can answer. How do you respond when your world becomes smaller? How do you face change when the life you once knew begins to fade? How do you find peace when circumstances refuse to stay the same? I am not here to tell you that everything you have heard is false. I am here to tell you that the picture is often incomplete. There are conversations about aging that many people avoid because they are uncomfortable, deeply personal, and impossible to measure with numbers alone. For decades, I searched outside myself for certainty. I believed the next piece of advice, the next routine, or the next healthy habit would finally make me feel prepared for old age. Instead, I discovered that the most important lessons were waiting somewhere I had rarely looked. So before you dismiss my story, stay with me a little longer. What changed my final years was not what I expected, and it began with a question I should have asked myself many decades earlier. I wish I could tell you that growing older arrives with a single, unforgettable moment. It does not. At least, it did not for me. It arrived quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it. One morning, my knees felt a little slower than they used to. I blamed the weather. A few months later, my back reminded me that lifting a heavy box was no longer effortless. Then came the mornings when my hands seemed reluctant to do what they had done without thinking for decades. One afternoon, I stood in my kitchen trying to open a glass jar. It should have taken only a few seconds. Instead, I stood there longer than I care to admit, twisting, stopping, trying again. Eventually, I smiled at myself and placed it back on the counter. The jar had not changed. I had. That was the moment I realized independence does not disappear all at once. It leaves quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments that most people never notice until they become personal. You begin asking different questions. Can I still carry my own groceries? Can I still climb the stairs without stopping halfway? Can I still drive after sunset with confidence? Can I still read the small print without reaching for stronger glasses? Each question seems small on its own. Together, they become a conversation you never expected to have with yourself. What surprised me most was not the physical effort. It was the feeling that every small limitation quietly introduced me to someone I barely recognized. For more than 30 years, I worked with my hands. I repaired broken things. I lifted heavy furniture without hesitation. Friends called when they needed help because they trusted my strength. Years later, it was my daughter carrying the bags while I walked beside her with empty hands. She never complained. She smiled. She slowed her pace to match mine. Her kindness filled me with gratitude, but it also reminded me that life had crossed a line I never imagined reaching. Nobody had prepared me for that invisible distance between remembering who you were and learning to accept who you are becoming. That invisible distance did not stop with my body. In many ways, it was only the beginning. As the years continued to pass, I slowly realized that aching joints and tired muscles were not the hardest part of growing older. They were challenges I could see. The deeper wounds arrived quietly, carried by telephone calls I never wanted to receive, and empty chairs that were never filled again. My oldest friend was Gerald. We met as young men when life seemed endless, and every year promised another adventure. We celebrated birthdays, raised our families, argued about baseball, laughed over stories that no one else found funny, and somehow made it through more than 60 years of friendship. Every Sunday morning, my phone would ring. I never looked at the screen because I already knew who it was. That small tradition became part of the rhythm of my life. Then one Sunday, the phone stayed silent. I told myself he was busy. The following Sunday, it stayed silent again. A few days later, his daughter called. Before she finished speaking, I understood why. After that, life seemed to change its rhythm. Another familiar face disappeared, then another. Neighbors I had greeted for decades, friends who knew my children when they were young, people who carried pieces of my history simply by remembering it with me. With every goodbye, the world became a little quieter, a little smaller, a little less familiar. I discovered that grief is not always one overwhelming storm. Sometimes it is a slow season that lingers longer than expected. Before one loss has settled into memory, another may arrive, asking your heart to make room once again. Over time, I found myself carrying not only memories of the people I loved, but also the responsibility of remembering stories that no one else could tell anymore. That was when I began to understand something I had never considered in my younger years. Growing older is not only about living longer. Sometimes it also means learning how to keep walking while carrying the love, the memories, and the quiet absence of those who once walked beside you. For a long time, I believed I understood what loss felt like. I was wrong. The passing of friends left empty spaces in my life, but there was one chair that remained occupied in my heart. Eleanor. We shared 53 years together. When I look back now, I do not remember our life as a collection of extraordinary moments. I remember ordinary days that slowly became extraordinary, simply because we lived them side by side. Morning coffee before the house was awake, long drives with no destination, quiet evenings when neither of us felt the need to speak, the little disagreements that seemed important for an hour and completely meaningless by bedtime. That was our life. Simple, imperfect, beautiful. Then everything began to change. Her strength faded little by little. There was no single moment when life divided itself into before and after. Instead, each passing week gently reminded us that time was asking more from both of us than either of us wanted to give. I stayed beside her through every appointment, every difficult conversation, every silent afternoon when words no longer seemed necessary. I held her hand because there was nothing else I could do. Sometimes love cannot solve a problem. Sometimes love simply refuses to leave. When she was gone, the world looked exactly the same. The sun still rose. Cars still passed outside my window. People still hurried through their ordinary lives. Only my world had changed. Friends encouraged me to stay active. My children reminded me to keep eating well. Neighbors invited me out for coffee. I accepted because I knew they cared. From the outside, I probably looked like a man learning to move forward. Inside, every room felt strangely empty. I discovered that loneliness is not always the absence of people. Sometimes it is the absence of one voice that made every ordinary day feel like home. No schedule could replace it. No hobby could erase it. No amount of staying busy could fill the quiet space that 53 years of shared life had left behind. For the first time, I understood that surviving loss and healing from it are not always the same journey. After Eleanor was gone, I believed the hardest chapter of my life had already been written. I did not yet understand that loneliness can change its shape. My children loved me. Please do not misunderstand me. They never stopped loving me. They called when they could. They visited whenever their schedules allowed. They worried about me more than they probably admitted. I saw that in their eyes every time they walked through my front door. But life has a way of asking more from each generation. They had careers to build, children to raise, bills to pay, and responsibilities that never seemed to end. I never blame them for living the lives they had worked so hard to create. Still, there were evenings when the house remained quiet after they left. The silence stayed much longer than the visit. My grandchildren grew taller between family gatherings. Sometimes I learned about their achievements from photographs before I heard their voices. I watched birthdays, vacations, school events, and milestones arrive through small images on a screen. Every picture made me smile. Every picture also reminded me how quickly time was moving. When the family gathered, everyone welcomed me with warmth. They hugged me. They asked how I was feeling. They made sure I had a comfortable chair. Then conversations naturally drifted toward careers, technology, schools, and plans for the future. I listened more than I spoke, not because anyone wanted to leave me out, simply because the world they were building moved at a speed I could no longer follow. Without anyone intending it, I slowly became part of the background. The grandfather sitting quietly in the corner, the familiar face in every family photograph, always included, not always involved. That realization carried a different kind of sadness. It was not the sharp pain of losing someone. It was the quiet understanding that life keeps moving exactly as it should. The people you love continue growing. They continue dreaming. They continue becoming who they are meant to be. And one of the most difficult lessons of growing older is learning to celebrate their journey even when it slowly carries them farther from your own. Love never disappeared. Only the distance between everyday moments quietly grew. As the months passed, I discovered that loneliness was not the only thing capable of changing a person. There was something that frightened me even more. It began so quietly that I almost laughed at it. A misplaced pair of glasses. A familiar name that refused to come when I needed it. Standing in the kitchen wondering whether I had already finished making my morning tea. Small moments, ordinary moments, the kind that almost everyone experiences from time to time. But for me, they became impossible to ignore because they seemed to arrive more often than before. What frightened me was not forgetting. It was noticing that I had forgotten. There is a strange feeling that comes with searching your own mind for something that once appeared without effort. You know it is there somewhere. You can almost reach it. yet it quietly slips away before you can hold it. The hardest moments were not the practical ones. They were the personal ones. One evening, I tried to remember the details of a vacation Eleanor and I had taken many years earlier. I could still see her smile. I could still remember the sound of her laughter. But parts of the story felt blurred, as though time had gently softened the edges of a photograph that had once been perfectly clear. I sat in silence longer than I expected, not because I had forgotten everything, because I wondered how many more memories might slowly change with time. My children noticed that I was becoming more cautious. They worried when I forgot appointments. They worried when I repeated the same story without realizing it. Most of all, they worried because they loved me. After many conversations, we reached a decision together. It was no longer the best choice for me to live alone. Leaving my home was one of the most emotional days of my life. I was not simply packing furniture. I was closing the door on decades of ordinary mornings, familiar routines, and quiet memories. The people at the nursing home treated me with patience and genuine kindness. I will always be grateful for that. But kindness and home are not always the same feeling. Many days I was not truly living. I was simply moving from one day to the next, wondering if this quiet routine was how the rest of my story would be written. I had almost convinced myself that this quiet routine was simply the final chapter of my life. Wake up, eat breakfast, sit by the window, watch the seasons change, wait for tomorrow to look very much like yesterday. Then, on an ordinary afternoon, something happened that I never expected. A familiar voice spoke my name. I looked toward the doorway and saw Thomas standing there. For a moment, neither of us said a word. The years between us seemed to disappear. He smiled, looked me up and down, and laughed. "Arthur, you look older than I remember." I laughed too, not the polite laugh people offer to be courteous, a real laugh, the kind that arrives before you have time to stop it. It had been so long that I had almost forgotten what genuine laughter felt like. Thomas sat beside me as though no time had passed. He did not ask me to pretend everything was fine. He did not tell me to stay positive. He did not offer easy answers to difficult questions. Instead, he listened, really listened. When I spoke about Eleanor, he remained quiet. When I spoke about my fears, he did not interrupt. When I admitted that some days I felt more like I was existing than truly living, he simply nodded because he understood. He had walked through loss, too. He had buried dreams. He had said goodbye to people he loved. His calm did not come from avoiding pain. It came from learning to live honestly beside it. That difference stayed with me. Over the following weeks, Thomas visited often. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we sat together in comfortable silence. Strangely, those quiet moments became just as meaningful as our conversations. One afternoon, he asked me a question that changed the direction of my thinking. "Arthur, why do you spend so much energy trying to manage every difficult feeling instead of allowing yourself to experience this season of life with honesty?" I had no answer. I realized I had spent years fighting against aging as though it were an enemy that could somehow be defeated. Every limitation felt like failure. Every difficult emotion felt like something that needed to be hidden or corrected. Thomas gently suggested another possibility. Perhaps growing older was not only something to survive, perhaps it could also become a time for reflection, acceptance, gratitude, and inner growth. I did not fully understand his words that day, but for the first time in many years, I found myself wondering if there was another way to see the life still waiting in front of me. That question stayed with me long after Thomas had gone home. For days, I found myself replaying our conversations. Perhaps I had spent too many years trying to repair everything outside myself, while rarely asking what was happening within. During one visit, Thomas brought a book with him. He placed it gently on the table beside my chair and said, "I am not asking you to believe anything today. I am only asking you to read with an open mind and decide for yourself." He explained that Falun Dafa was a spiritual cultivation practice centered on the values of truthfulness, compassion, and patience. He told me that many people approached it as a way to reflect on their character and their relationship with life. He never promised easy answers. He never claimed it would remove every hardship. He simply said that its principles had helped him face difficult seasons with greater peace. I will admit that I was skeptical. At nearly 100 years old, I wondered what difference a new way of thinking could possibly make. My circumstances had not changed. I still missed Eleanor every single day. I still carried memories of friends who were no longer here. I still woke each morning in the same room. Yet there was something about Thomas that I could not ignore. His peace did not seem forced. It was quiet, steady, honest. So I began reading a little each day. Instead of searching for someone else to blame, I started asking myself different questions. How much anger had I been carrying without realizing it? How much energy had I spent wishing life had unfolded differently? How often had I measured my happiness by things I could no longer control? Those questions were uncomfortable. They asked me to look inward instead of outward. Slowly, I found myself practicing greater patience with my own limitations. I became more forgiving toward the people around me and even toward myself. My circumstances remained much the same, but my perspective gradually began to change. For the first time in many years, I discovered that moments of peace did not always depend on changing the world around me. Sometimes they began with changing the way I responded to it. As the weeks turned into months, I stopped looking for dramatic changes. In fact, the most meaningful ones were so quiet that I almost overlooked them. The building around me had not changed. The seasons still passed outside my window. My hair did not become dark again. Time did not suddenly begin moving backward. Life remained exactly what it had always been. Yet something inside me was undeniably different. I no longer woke each morning asking what I had lost. Instead, I began asking how I wanted to live the day that had been given to me. That single change reshaped everything. The fear that had once followed me from room to room slowly became less overwhelming. It did not disappear. Some difficult mornings still arrived. Some memories still brought tears. Some evenings still felt longer than I wished. But those moments no longer defined my entire life. I noticed that I became more patient with myself. When my body asked me to slow down, I listened instead of becoming frustrated. When sadness appeared, I stopped treating it like an enemy. I allowed it to sit beside gratitude rather than replacing it. Even the people around me noticed that something had changed. The nurses often commented that I smiled more. My children said our conversations felt lighter. Thomas simply smiled because he understood that the greatest changes are often invisible. As my confidence gradually returned, I reached another important decision. Together with my family, and after careful discussion, I moved into a modest apartment where I could safely enjoy a greater sense of independence while staying connected with the people who cared about me. It was not a return to the life I had lived decades earlier. It was the beginning of a different chapter. For the first time in many years, being alone no longer felt the same as being abandoned. The quiet that had once frightened me slowly became a place for reflection. I found comfort in simple routines, peaceful mornings, thoughtful reading, gentle movement, and meaningful conversations. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by the strength of my body or by how closely my present resembled my past. Growing older had changed many things, but it had not taken away my ability to choose kindness, gratitude, patience, or hope. That became the foundation beneath every new day. I finally understood that while we cannot control every circumstance life places before us, we can continue shaping the character with which we meet those circumstances. And in that quiet realization, I found a deeper sense of freedom than I had believed possible. If you have stayed with me until this moment, then thank you. You have listened to the story of one old man, not because my life was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary in so many ways. I loved, I worked, I made mistakes, I celebrated victories, I experienced loss. And like every person who is fortunate enough to grow older, I discovered that every season of life asks different questions. Looking back over 100 years, there is one lesson I wish I had understood much sooner. Do not build your entire happiness on things that time can quietly take away. Our bodies change. Our careers eventually end. Children grow into lives of their own. Friends move away or pass on. Even the places we call home can change with the passing years. None of these realities mean life has lost its value. They simply remind us that change is part of being human. What remains within our control is how we choose to meet those changes. For me, learning to cultivate honesty, compassion, patience, gratitude, and self-reflection transformed the way I experienced growing older. That was my personal journey. Yours may look different. Each person finds meaning in different places, through different beliefs, traditions, relationships, and life experiences. What matters is taking the time to nurture the part of yourself that circumstances cannot easily define. If you are young, begin now. Do not wait for hardship before asking what truly gives your life meaning. If you are caring for aging parents or grandparents, remember that your presence may become one of the greatest gifts you can offer. Sometimes a conversation, a shared meal, or a few unhurried minutes together carry more value than you realize. And if you are already growing older like me, please remember this. Your story is not measured only by the strength of your body. It is also measured by the kindness you continue to show, the wisdom you choose to share, and the hope you continue to carry into each new day. We cannot stop time. We cannot avoid every loss. We cannot control every chapter that life places before us. But we can choose to live each chapter with dignity, compassion, courage, and an open heart. If my story has encouraged you to reflect on your own journey, then these memories have served a meaningful purpose. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take good care of your body when you can. Take good care of your relationships while you have the opportunity. And never forget to take good care of the person you are becoming, because that quiet work may be one of the greatest gifts you will ever give yourself.